Welcome, everybody, and thanks for being with us. We're coming into the afternoon part. I'm really excited about this panel. This is a panel made up of representatives from 3 universities who will talk about the approaches that they have taken. And you all received in the packet of information you got from us links to all of their policies. So they're not going to go through chapter and verse on that, but talk to you more about the history of it, the process of it, and other kinds of approaches that they're using. So I'm going to identify who all of them are, and then we'll start working our way through. Our overall plan is that each group, each set of presenters will do about 10 to 12 minutes talking about things. Then they all want to kind of be in it together because they're also learning from each other and want to raise questions with each other, and then open it up to everybody else to ask questions or share information. For my panelists, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through and introduce you by name because I know you're going to talk a little bit more. We've got your bios and you're going to talk a little bit more about who you are within that context. From the University of Wisconsin Madison, we have Michael Bernard Donals, and his colleague Tammy Clumpion is joining from the University of Wisconsin Madison. We also have Susan Bond from the University of South Carolina, Columbia. And last but by all means not least, we have Melissa Broderick from Harvard University. Thanks. So we're going to start off with Michael and Tammy from the University of Wisconsin Madison talking about their work. So take it away, Michael and Tammy.
Thanks, Laura Lee. I'll start this. We're going to tag team a little bit. I'm Mike Bernard Donalds. I'm a faculty member in the English department at UW-Madison, but I just got off a 6-year term in the provost office where I spent quite a lot of time working on hostile and intimidating behavior policies. So what I want to do is to begin by talking about how we went about creating our anti-bullying policy, and to say that it's a success story, but there were some unforeseen consequences of what we did. So we're going to talk about how we developed the policy, what exigence it addressed, and what we discovered in addressing it. This work took place in a couple of different stages. The first was the idea generating stage, and this was kind of ad hoc grassroots. There were 2 deans who were dealing with instances of bullying in their schools and colleges, and they saw a policy gap. There was nothing specifically to address hostile and intimidating behavior, and so they pulled together an informal group of maybe 30 different people. They were faculty members, staff members, HR professionals, and they met over the better part of a year and a half. And what they did was to develop some definitions of and dynamics of bullying from the scholarly literature. They collected some real world examples of bullying that had happened on our campus. And then they began to look at other institutions' policies insofar as they had them on bullying. And this phase was really crucial to understanding what the problem was, but it didn't have any authority to do anything. So to remedy this, the second phase involved governance. And at that point, the Faculty Senate charged a working group to write a policy on bullying. And that ad hoc group met with the first informal group to understand what they had learned and to see the material they had pulled together. And the Senate then discussed the draft policy and eventually adopted it. Key aspects of the policy involve a reasonable person standard. In other words, it's based on the effect of the behavior, not on the intention of the person who was perpetrating it. Second, the behavior is specifically called out as not furthering the university's operational interests. And this was key to warding off concerns that the policy interfered with academic freedom. Another key piece of the policy is that it created informal and formal stages of dealing with instances of hostile and intimidating behavior so as not to directly go to punitive measures right from the start. And the policy also was linked to disciplinary processes that were already in place to ensure just cause and due process. Then we went to the implementation phase. We had a policy, so now what do we do with it, essentially? So this there was an implementation work group created, and it reviewed the governance group's work, the informal group's work to understand, how best to address hostile and intimidating behavior. And one of the key aspects of the implementation was that we heard from members of the Ombuds Office. They were the ones who were hearing stories on the ground, and the implementation group needed to understand what people were seeing and what they wanted by way of resolving instances. And then we also heard from a key member of the Ombuds Office who was part of the university's efforts to stop sexual harassment in the early and mid 1990s. And the implementation group drew a lot of resources, and frankly, we stole a lot of what the sexual harassment group had done to put to make the implementation work. Then the implementation group issued recommendations, the first of which was to create an educational campaign. We needed to educate the campus on what hostile and intimidating behavior was, how the policy worked. And we made a concerted effort to start with leadership. In other words, leadership had to own the problem. They had to own the solution to the problem. So we needed to get their buy-in first. We also set up what we're calling hostile and intimidating behavior liaisons. This was a group of a dozen faculty and staff members who were trained to understand the policy and the dynamics of bullying, and they could serve as a resource for people who just had questions about bullying, particularly those who were experiencing it. And then the third implementation piece was to train HR professionals, and this was really key because most investigations of hostile and intimidating behavior occurred in HR. So people needed to trust that the HR community understood what bullying was and took it seriously. Now, in these first stages, there were some concerns and questions that came up. The first of which was what we called the weaponization of hostile and intimidating behavior policy. We found that bullies have made accusations both to further accusations of bullying by other people, to further their own interests and also to ward off charges against them. A second issue was that we initially focused on discipline, but we did not really well address how to prevent hostile and intimidating behavior from happening in the first place. And Tammy will talk a bit about how we address that issue. Third, deans now want reports of bullying that's happening in their units. And this is fine, but we haven't worked out a way to report because there are significant confidentiality issues that stand in the way of a workable policy. And then last, each of our employment groups, and there are 3, have their own policy. This is not a particular problem because the definitions are the same across the groups, but it does mean that we don't have a policy for graduate students, for example, and for postdocs. So there are still some gaps that we're dealing with. So I'm going to turn it over to Tammy, and she'll talk about the education and prevention stages.
Thanks, Michael. And hello, everyone. I am Tammy Clumpion, and I have had the privilege of partnering with Michael on our work at UW-Madison in regards to our HIB policy. And I am positioned in the Office of Human Resources, specifically in learning and talent development. So what I'm going to continue Michael's, our story, as Michael started it, by talking about the educational campaign that he had highlighted. So we recognized at the institution that policy is only as good as awareness and application. And so to make the policy come to life and be sustainable across campus, we knew we needed to create an educational campaign. So this was done in partnership, as Michael mentioned, and it started with identification of key content that employees should know and understand about the policy. From that content, once we were able to identify that, we were then able to determine what the priority learning outcomes would be in a workshop, a policy and process workshop that would inform employees on campus about what this policy was. It would focus on 5 elements: definition, a shared definition of what hostile and intimidating behavior was, and illustrations of what we refer to as HIB as defined by the policy. It would walk participants and learners through the informal and formal processes that were created to support the reporting of HIB. It would elevate campus resources that could provide guidance, support, more information, referral, and consultation for those who were experiencing, witnessing, or were accused of HIB. And it also provided provides some paths for folks to understand what is available, what their rights and responsibilities are if they are a target of hostile and intimidating behavior or concerning workplace behavior, if they're accused of it, if they witness it. And also, we really honed in on the fact that supervisors and former leaders have a responsibility to not only take complaints of hostile and intimidating behavior seriously, but also to create a tone. This is part of that prevention piece that Michael mentioned, to create a tone within their department that doesn't allow for hostile and intimidating behavior. And all of this educational campaign workshop design use real and relevant case scenarios. So Michael mentioned that was part of the creation of the policy. It continues to be a part of the application of the policy through this workshop. Michael mentioned that we piloted this with leadership first, and that was really to ensure that they had a clear understanding of the policy from the top and to get buy-in before we launched it out to campus. And it also gave us an opportunity to get feedback on the workshop, and we got lots of feedback, which allowed for us to have some continuous improvement. And we were able to launch the workshop to full campus in fall of 2018. So you might be curious about what the workshop involves. We have, on the average, 15 to 20 volunteer trained workshop facilitators that represent across employee groups. So we have faculty facilitators, staff, and university staff. And we do that because we know representation matters, particularly in this learning space. And we try really hard to have different representatives in our facilitator group. So our facilitation is done by 2 to 3 facilitators for each workshop. We also have a workforce relations subject matter expert in the space to answer any specific questions related to the policy. And also often we have found that questions about the investigation may come up in the workshop, and our workforce relations colleagues can answer those questions specifically. We did find once we launched the workshop that we were starting to get unit specific requests, meaning that schools, colleges, and divisions and units were asking if we could bring the workshop to them. And we have been able to meet most of those requests as well. I'd say about 6 to 10 a semester. And it should be noted that these are in-person workshops. In March, our in-person learning was paused on campus, and we did pivot to virtual learning in May of 2020 and continue to offer the workshops in our virtual platforms and continue to have participation in them. I also just want to highlight, and this was really through the vision and leadership of Michael, a community of practice was created to support our liaisons and facilitators. So they come together about once or twice a year, and it's just an opportunity for them to crowdsource with each other, maybe challenges or questions they're facing in supporting our learners and individuals who are coming to liaisons with questions or current scenarios that they're engaged with. And it also gives us, I think, as folks who have a pulse on the larger HIB initiative, to just understand what's happening culturally and on the climate across campus. So just really quickly, a couple of things we've learned. Our predominant audience for the workshops have been academic and university staff. Faculty are our lowest in attendance in the general employee workshops, but highest in the requested trainings for the unit. So the most of our requested trainings to bring the workshop to units are coming from our faculty academic spaces. We do have a post survey, and it suggests that there's significantly greater understanding of policy and processes and resources after completing the workshop. And our post survey also suggests a need for participants to know what to do and say when they witness HIB, which is really some of our future planning. We now have a bystander intervention workshop that we can refer participants to, and we're also working on a community values and intentions workshop. And I'll just share another future initiative that we have is we are currently in the process of creating an online HIB module that would be self-guided, self-paced, and will include new content around prevention, really specifically focusing on social identity, positionality, privilege, and shared responsibility as it concerns workplace behavior. So I think I did that all in the amount of time.
That was brilliant, both of you. Thanks, Michael and Tammy. I know we're going to come back more on this conversation. Next, I'd like to invite Susan Bond to take the screen. Susan?
Hi, thank you. Thank you for including me today. This is, I've gotten to monitor a little bit of your previous conversation at noon, and very much gained new hope after listening to our conversation today. I'm going to go ahead and skip over some of the background details about our policy at the University of South Carolina, primarily because, Michael, I felt like you did the job for me. It was a similar impetus that started with several folks starting to put together a team of faculty and working with administration to realize that there was indeed a problem and a need for the policy to be owned by the faculty. And so that's going to be one of the issues that I will point out today. So briefly, I'll do a little bit with our context and I'll describe our policy, but very briefly. And then I'll talk about our successes and challenges and hopefully have time for questions. I also wanted to open up with what I think is really important for me in this role as the faculty civility advocate. And that is that I need to own my own professional and personal code of ethics. So whenever I do the presentations, as my colleagues just shared, I start with sharing my personal and professional code of ethics so that I hope to inform the audience where I'm grounded at. So a couple of key phrases, I've made a word cloud of it, but I'm not showing you because I don't think we have enough time, but a couple of phrases that stick out for me are humanity, all of humanity, justice, fairness, respectful, and then of course, for me, personal grounding in faith and values. So that's my word cloud. So when you look at our bullying policy, we have a really high threshold, and that's another big distinction between the policy that was just described. Our policy does have the language severe, pervasive, and intentional. So it is a high bar, and that's revealed one of the challenges that we have. It's success. I count it as a success that we have the policy, but I note that it is a challenge that we have a policy only for faculty. We do not have a policy for staff. If staff have problems in terms of relationships that might involve bullying or other harassing behavior, their only recourse is through our HR department. Bullying examples, the typical, we include verbal, malicious gossip, shouting, intimidating, and then of course, cyberbullying. And our complaint procedures really have two pathways. First, you could go the informal pathway, which would not end up in my office, but instead would go through the ombuds, and the ombuds would seek to, if perhaps mediation is appropriate or some other method, to try to identify the needs of the two parties and help them kind of rectify the concerns and the dispute that exists between them. Ombudsman would also go over my policy with the policy that I'm responsible for enforcing. And they would go over that policy and say, if you believe you would fall under here, then you could also go the next step in a more formal route and request an investigation from the FCA. And my investigation and report, one of the goals is for it to be very timely. And that's also a challenge, to get faculty to respond to you in 30 days so that you can schedule interviews and conversations and circle back if you need, find out who all should be involved, can get very complex during the investigation, especially if you have anything like a holiday or some other event. So we've discovered many challenges with our investigation timeline that we advertise for faculty. Another issue that happens is the restoration of people's reputations. And when you think about this, oftentimes bullying has perhaps gone unchecked for quite some time. And lots of people have built up defensive walls and animosity that is pretty deep-seated. So in some regards, I also attempt to find out, how do we restore what would be appropriate relationships? What can we put in place of? That's not kind of formally under my policy, but it's something I realized probably about 6 months into my role, that if I wasn't attending to some of those issues, I was just going to get my repeat offenders, if you will. If bullying is extreme, and if I determine that there is in fact bullying, I would refer it to the provost's office. And there, in consultation with a grievance committee, there would be additional actions taken. When I issue a report, and here I'm going into my challenges because they're always ever present in my mind, my report essentially could just stop. I have no authority to ensure that my recommendations are adhered to. I have no guarantee that anything will happen subsequent to my issuing of a report. if I haven't had to refer it in terms of finding severe and pervasive intentional harassment or bullying. If I haven't done that, then it's up to the department chair, the dean, and the provost's office how to handle it. They just consider my recommendations. So those are some of our process. Okay, so let me go to now a little bit about civility, just really quickly. I think it doesn't mean you can't have a strong opinion. And this is a part of our bullying, workplace bullying procedure, our policy that recognizes academic freedom sometimes means I'm going to call somebody in question when they don't adhere to a policy or they put forward an idea and I disagree with. And that's not bullying. And that's not also being uncivil. But that is very difficult because I do also get those kinds of complaints from faculty. They didn't like the email that such and such sent because it disagreed with their views. So it might have been a more conservative or a more liberal perspective, either way offending their beliefs. And yet I have to explain to them that's probably more of an academic freedom issue, not so much of a bullying issue. But could you find other ways to talk with that individual directly about some of your concerns of getting certain kinds of emails from them? So I think that's important to help people understand. What have been some of my successes and challenges? I think the policy is in and of itself a success. It's not perfect, but that we have one is a good thing. And that we're able to, similar to what Michael and his colleague were sharing, we're similarly able to do presentations. Now I say we, and I'm using that the royal we, it's only me. I have an office of one for my faculty civility advocate. So I'm able to do presentations across campus when I'm invited, and I do trainings with all new administrators. So department chairs, if they become a new department chair, they're going to have to go through some sort of training with myself, and a couple others from our EOP office, for example, will also train, just to make sure they're aware of some of the burdens now administratively that are placed on them that weren't probably in place when they were in a faculty role. Another thing that I found as a success is the mitigation strategies. And what do I mean by mitigation strategies? What I've sometimes encountered when sitting with a complainant who believes they're being bullied or harassed or tormented, or, you go through the list of things that they think is going on and it's concerning. I find some level of success when I can't sort of shut down the bully, when I find that I'm powerless in that scenario. I focus on ways to mitigate the harm that's being done to the individual who's complaining. And some of those are, I talk to them about managing emotions, their own emotions, how they are, can kind of own their emotions. We talk about nonviolent communication, ways for them, rather than escalating a conflict, to use their words to explain to the perceived bully, what might it look like for us to be able to get along in the future? What can I ask from you? And not putting blame, not being defensive, not being judgmental, but rather simply asking the bully to consider, this is how I feel when you say that. Maybe that's not what you meant, but I'm interpreting it this way. Should I be interpreting it differently? And it just opens up a dialogue. So I teach them some of those skills about nonviolent communication. And I recommend the book. I think it's Marshall Rosenberg who wrote that. But everybody knows this stuff. And then another thing I talk to them about is compassion and thriving. And those are two things that are solely within their control as the victim complainant. They're not in control of the bully. And one of the big things I've said this to many people, whispered to them, don't forget, a bully needs a victim. Don't be their victim. So when you're going into a difficult situation, don't forget, don't let them make you their victim. And if they don't have a victim, it's going to be really hard to be successful at bullying. So that I'm going to close with that, because I could go into each of those areas, but I'm going to go ahead and cede my time because I hope we can discuss. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Susan. That was really interesting. And now Melissa Broderick from Harvard University. Melissa, you have the screen.
Thanks. Great to see all of you, and really appreciate hearing from Michael, Tammy, and Susan, and looking forward to jumping in and talking a bit more. So some of the things that I'm going to share with you will echo some of what you've already heard here today, but I'm the ombuds for the medical school, dental school, and School of Public Health at Harvard. And I want to talk with you a bit about what goes on in my office around supporting people who are feeling bullied, and also talk a little bit about what the university as a whole is doing in terms of policy. I do want to just start with a quick overview of the Nobuds Office, because I know that there can be a lot of misunderstandings about what we do. But just to let you know that our office started in 1991 to deal with sexual harassment complaints at the medical school. And it has since grown to serve faculty, staff, students, and trainees from 3 schools at Harvard, all in the medical area, and then anyone who has an appointment at one of the 15 affiliate hospitals. So it's a large crew of people who could show up on my doorstep any day. Here are the cornerstones. Confidentiality is critical for an ombuds office. The only thing we have to report are imminent safety issues. We're also independent by design. I like to joke that I have no boss, but it really is not quite a joke. I really don't quite have a boss, which is wonderful. My role is to be an impartial third party, right? So I'm not there to judge anyone who comes in, but to really help them sort through their concerns. And the last piece, which is a little different from what you've heard from others in terms of informal or formal, our office is an informal one. So we do not do any kind of investigations. We're not a place of notice, but as has been said already, we can help direct people to those policies and procedures, to those places where they might want to file a formal complaint. So fundamentally, we're there to do a lot of listening, help people identify their issues, their goals, and then what the range of options is that's available to them. And for some, it's they choose to do nothing. And for some, and get out as soon as they can. For others, it is that they may file a formal complaint, lots of things in between. I wanted to share just a few statistics with you from my office. We handle somewhere between 450 and 500 cases a year. And the self-reported issues that we get, we started specifically tracking abrasive behavior is what we call it in the medical area in 4 years ago. And so the range of percentage of issues coming to us that are focused on bullying behavior has ranged between 10.7% and 11.3%. So a really hefty amount of what we're hearing from people. And for the university, which has an office on the other side of the river, it's between 9% and 12.9% over those years. We primarily hear from postdoctoral fellows, and the university primarily hears from graduate students. And then staff generally is another category that we hear a lot from. Wanted to share a couple of success stories. They're very different, so I just wanted to help you to see how we work with people. Not that long ago, I had a postdoc coming in complaining about their PI, who they felt was very bullying of them. They felt undermined whenever they raised science questions or ideas. They felt like their publications were getting stalled out because of their PI not reviewing them. They felt that others got credit for their work in the lab. And they felt that their PI had a very in-your-face way of communicating and also showed a lot of favoritism. So this person came partly because they were really feeling the effects of this career-wise and also emotionally, physically even. And their goal was to finish their work and get out of the lab as quickly as possible. We talked about all the options, and for a variety of reasons, they decided that they would like to try to have a facilitated conversation in my office. So I then met with the PI, who was horrified to know that they were seen as a bully, and expressed their own concerns about the dynamics between the two of them, felt also disrespected, frustrated, felt that the postdoc was super defensive, arrogant, unwilling to take directions, also had a challenging communication style, but fundamentally wanted to try to make things better and hadn't had this kind of situation with another postdoc in the lab in the past. So they met in my Zoom office, and they had a very productive and honest conversation. And what they really explored was the difference between intentions and impact for each of them, and sort of where things weren't connecting. They talked about communication styles. There were cultural differences between them, and that played into this particular situation. They talked about the goals for the postdoc, and surprisingly, they weren't far off from one another about what they were looking for. And so what they came up with were some very concrete behavioral changes for the PI in particular, but for both of them, some concrete goals and guidelines for the postdoc being able to move on with their career. I had another case, very different, where someone came in and described a very classic kind of bullying behavior. Someone who was in a leadership position in a department, who was seen as being a horror show, if you will, yelling, public put downs, withholding opportunities, sabotaging people that they felt threatened by. Everyone knew about it. No one was doing anything about it. And so this person came in, and a lot of people were leaving, had left because of this person. And the visitor said that a lot of other people felt similarly. And so what I said was, well, you're welcome to let other people know about the office. So one by one, other people from that same department came in. And over time, I never broke confidentiality, but they figured out from each other that a number of people had been into the Ombuds office and decided that they wanted to work together as a group. And so with me, they did. They decided to come in as a group to do some strategizing about what they might be able to do. And some of the questions that we talked about were, who were the leaders who could affect change? Who were their allies? How could they frame their interests in ways that might be also the interests of the institution? And liability is often a big one for an institution. What was going to be the best timing? As often happens with Ombuds work, people leave my office and then I never hear from them again. And in this case, I happened to run into one of this group about a year later, and they said that the bully had been fired. And they felt that part of their being fired was because, it was a lot of things coming together at the right time, that people were finally willing to pay attention. But it was also a part of their efforts of speaking as a group, being able to work in a unified way to bring forward their concerns. So, there are limitations clearly to what an Ombuds office can do. I can't make anything happen. I'm not an advocate. I don't even consider myself an advice giver. I really see myself as being there to help people do their own best thinking so that they can figure out what's best for them. Clearly, fear of retaliation, huge power differentials when brought to me are big stumbling blocks for people moving forward. And often there are solo complainants, and that can get in the way at times. But it certainly can be effective in the right circumstances. So just a couple of words about formal efforts at Harvard. And really, as I hear my colleagues, we're way behind. And what happened in one of the other roles of an ombuds is to bring forward to leadership trends, hotspots, places where there may be gaps in policies and procedures, or places where policies and procedures just aren't working as intended. And so I brought forward a concern along with other people. So it certainly wasn't just me, but a number of people were beginning to feel like there is no formal place in the medical area for people to bring concerns about faculty, and specifically around abusive and intimidating behavior. And it was broader than faculty, but that was sort of the impetus at that point. So in 2017, a policy was developed that's called the Abusive and/or Intimidating Behavior Policy, and it's on the website. I asked, how's it going? Are people using this? There are 2 levels to it, as others have said. There have only been 2 formal complaints, and I'll say something about that in a moment, which trigger a full investigation. But there have been a number of, and I don't have numbers, a number of informal complaints where people have cited the policy, and then there are deans of the students, graduate students, faculty affairs, and the head of HR who will receive those kind of informal complaints to help people try to work things through with a lesser kind of investigatory process. The other thing to let you know is that the university all across Harvard, about 4 or 5 months ago, began an effort to promote anti-bullying, anti-discrimination, and anti-harassment throughout the university. And so they put some subcommittees in place for each of those areas to consider what's in place, how well are these things working, what else is needed, and best practices elsewhere. And so one of the things that our office can do is help to provide statistics. I think, as Michael said, the Ombuds Office can provide information, can provide stories, can provide themes, can provide some of the numbers to share with people who are doing that kind of work. My sense, and thinking about, there have only been a couple of people who have used the formal process in the medical area so far. My hope for the university, and I think the challenge is, I hear over and over again from people coming through my office about any of the policies that are in place for formally complaining, whether it's Title IX or whether it's something like this, that they need something that's efficient. And so often these processes aren't. They may take months. They need to be safe. And even though we have a retaliation policy, as I think most institutions do, what does that mean, and how well can people truly feel protected by that? The process needs to be fair, and that's such a potentially subjective kind of criteria for the person looking in on the policy being developed or put out there. And I think the last thing is people are really looking for as much transparency as possible. And as we all know, there are constraints, right, in terms of the confidentiality, whether it's my confidentiality in my informal office or confidentiality in formal offices. So I think those are some of the challenges that are facing Harvard, and maybe have faced others as you've set up your programs. As I've been, just to wrap up, as I've been in this job for about, I guess, going on my 12th year, I am more and more seeing just how entrenched these kinds of behaviors are, just how much this kind of bullying behavior is a part of our institution. And it's discouraging, but it's also heartening that people are starting to take a look at these things more fully. And I just applaud those of you who have put this conference on, and Mortiza and I go back, really appreciate his efforts to really bring things to the forefront, because I feel hopeful at Harvard that things will change, things are changing, and that there are lots of ways to address the variety of kinds of bullying situations that are out there. So thanks. That's it for me.
Thanks very much, Melissa. That was, all three of these discussions and presentations for me were just amazing in terms, and I'm scribbling things down. And, amongst the four of you, you had talked about, as we were prepping for this, an opportunity to kind of talk across each other, talk with each other. So are there things that you would like to ask each other or question before we open it up for the whole group?
I would love to ask the question about formal versus informal, and maybe Michael, knowing that, and Tammy, knowing that you have sort of a range of offerings, and Susan as well, how often people use the formal process and whether it feels effective.
During my 6 years in the provost office, I tended mostly to see the formal process because of my role. But anecdotally, I would say that a good half of bullying cases were handled informally in one way or the other. In other words, it didn't go to grievance or complaint.
Right.
But I don't remember who said it, but the biggest problem is or two problems. One is confidentiality and one is retaliation. I suspect that there are a lot of instances of bullying that are sort of beneath the surface that are not being addressed formally or informally because of concerns about sort of further escalating the problem. But like I said, I would say about half were, based on anecdotal evidence, about half were addressed informally.
I'll make a little distinction because our process imposes an expectation that the complainant first attempt to informally resolve. So every person who comes to my office has first had a consultation with the ombudsperson, because that's part of our unwritten policy, but it's inferred that you need to first try informally to resolve the issue. And I've only been in this role since 2019, and since January of 2019, so just over a year and a half. And I've had 28 cases brought to my attention, but none of those, and goes back to my policy threshold being too high, in my opinion, none of those have resulted in a finding of bullying according to the policy. Lots of recommendations, lots of efforts to resolve and repair damage, but no formal complaints resulted in a formal report of bullying.
So Susan, one other follow-up question. Given that it sounds like it's a bit of a mandate, if I'm hearing you right, to start informally, are there people who just refuse and then they just kind of step away from it all because of the concern about retaliation, even, at that level?
I haven't personally observed that.
Yeah.
In part, I think there is a pretty good reputation of our Ombuds Office, that it's a very helpful conversation and kind of helps you just bounce your thinking off. If you're the complainant, you're going to somebody to voice it and kind of put it out there, and maybe sometimes discover something about yourself and the situation before having to go to the formal route. So I haven't seen it. What I have seen, though, is I have far more contacts who never follow through with a bullying investigation. So they've gone the informal route, and when I share with them all of the information and documentation that I would need for them to come my route, they usually trail off. Those are the people I never hear from again. Now, some of them I have, probably in those 28, 4 of them I have referred immediately to EOP, because there were discriminatory factors at play. And I explained to them, for one, the policy requires, but for 2, legally, they're going to have a much better chance of resolution with some actual meaning and some actual consequences if they go through the EOP, as opposed to going through my office, which has very unenforceable kinds of authority.
But does anybody want to comment on the use of coaching that they know of at their institution?
I'll just say I know it is something that is offered in some situations when something comes forward, especially when there's, as you might imagine, sort of a repeat offender. That name comes up a lot as having that kind of behavior. So we certainly see it, but it's not mandated.
Okay.
And I'll pile on just to say, I saw Barbara wrote in the chat that coaching could be one of the recommendations, and that's what I use. I will refer somebody, even though I might not have a formal report or a finding of bullying, I still have concerns. And so I'll suggest that coaching be a strategy to pursue through the HR office.
Somebody's asking about any discussion you have about what are the background skills or credentials of folks who might work as coaches for people, to coach people who are engaging in these behaviors.
All I know is in the HR, I believe they pursue traditional human resources kinds of skills and certificates, and then that's how they develop the skills to coach. I don't have the capacity in my solo office to do coaching on top of the investigations and presentations and more informal meetings with individuals. And I might just add, because I kind of screams through this part of my presentation, but this idea of when I talk about how a victim can try to get out of victimhood, even though I might be unable, and nobody's really able to address certain bullies in our institution. For example, and I don't want to share dirty laundry, but this is just a fact that there has not been a faculty member lose their job in 32 years. Wow. Not a single one. Now, have they perhaps resigned and went somewhere else when there were challenges? Yeah, perhaps, but not a single faculty member has ever lost their tenure as a result of bullying or harassment, for that matter. And here I get into more serious areas with that, that the EOP office is responsible for. So really what I felt needed to happen, given sort of the stark reality of our circumstances, is that I had to empower victims. And so that's through the nonviolent communication, so that the victim could kind of own their own reflective feeling, naming the problem, asking what they believed was happening whenever the bully talked to them in a certain way, and then asking the bully, could you talk to me like this? Could you be specific with what you want me to do, in hopes that I might be able to end this endless cycle of harm between us? And so sometimes like asking the victim to do that. The other thing, and I talk to victims about, is that thriving area, and the thriving notion that you do become less of a victim when you feel totally empowered and you're getting life satisfaction and happiness and joy and fulfilled outside of the control of that bully. So let the bully have their control, but you take control of all other aspects of your life in a way that those aspects become far greater than whatever you're experiencing with the bully. So the thriving, and then the last one, sorry, I have to go through my notes because I don't want to miss it, is when I talk about the natural state of compassion. And I find that sometimes we have a need to assume that the bully is just evil. They're just a bad person, when in fact, they might be a victim at home. They might be a victim in their supervisor relationship. And so they're passing it forward. So a natural state of compassion asks me, even though I might feel like the victim, to find, is there some humanity in my bully that I might at least accept they're doing this not because of me, but because of something else. And it might make it easier to have that relationship with that individual and just minimize it, but still at least looking at them with some level of compassion and possible understanding.
I want to jump in here really quick and address, I'm an English professor. I have no training in any ombuds related areas, but one of the conversations that I most frequently had was with department chairs. And this is in the vein of, not letting the bully win. And most of my conversations with department chairs were about, what are who are you waiting for to stand up and recognize that this behavior is not productive? So I spent a lot of time basically helping department chairs develop a backbone to call out bullying behavior when it happened. And when a chair does it, it's very effective. There was a question in the chat about, what if something doesn't happen over the course of a number of years, what do you do? And I've had calls from ombuds people to my office in the provost suite that said, look, there's this thing that's been going on for years and years and years. I can't do anything about it, and I can't give you details, but here's information. And I'll take it to HR, and I'll take it to the provost office, even without the details, in order to light a fire under somebody who's not doing their work, essentially, not taking the action they need to take. So it's in the same vein as, giving people backbone. I felt like in the provost office, that was kind of my job, was to help build people's backbones to deal with stuff like this.
And I think that's, such an important part of the ombuds role, is develop these collaborative relationships while maintaining our independence, so that we can bring things to people who can do something in a way that we can't. I also just wanted to go back, Susan, to a comment you made about, getting out of the mindset of being a victim. I feel like so much of the work that we do in our office, I joke about being cheerleaders, but it really is about helping people to think about where their power lies, because I think they get into these situations and they feel like they have absolutely no power. And they may not have some of the most obvious kinds of power, but they have power. And it's fulfilling for me to spend time with people and to see them start to relax into this notion that, in fact, there are things they have, or there are people they know who are more powerful than the bully that they can go to. So there are, just all the various kinds of power that they can harness that may be brought to bear on a tough situation.